Okay, so now we are moving along in Arthur Young, and we are at chapter 4, actually, which is called the Four Levels. Now, the reason why he has four levels is we've seen his V-shaped diagram with the left side of it showing the fall of light at the top into subatomic particles, into atoms, and then at the nadir molecules. And then on the right half, we see the ascent toward plants, then animals, then humans. So there's 7 stages. But the 2 stages, light, for instance, in human consciousness, forms level 1. The next level down, subatomic particles in animals form level 2. They are analogous. Level 3, atoms and plants. And then level 4 is simply molecules, molecular combinations. So there are 7 stages, 4 levels. And as we'll see, what makes the 4 levels analogous to each other has to do with the principle of symmetry, which is the key idea here that Jung introduces in this chapter. And so first he says that with regard to levels of descent now, we have to take into account 3 different transformations. First is the division. The first stage of the fall is the division of the initial unity. The initial unity, of course, is light, so it has to be divided. But that's the same in every metaphysical system. If we think about Sri Aurobindo, the initial unity is Brahman. So then that has to be divided into pairs of opposites. So everything has to be divided. So that's the first step down of the fall into matter. And the second step is that with these 3 subsequent transformations of matter on the left half of the arc, which has to do with physics, the right half with biology. So the left half of the arc moves from homogeneity to heterogeneity. So light is homogeneous. Every photon is the same. But now when you move down to the level of subatomic particles, now we have 2 types of particles, protons and electrons. Then when we move down to atoms, now we have the periodic table of elements, and there's over 100-something atoms there, each with its own identity. And then finally with molecules, there are countless numbers of combinations of molecules. And so that's the principle of division as it moves down. And then there are, thirdly, changes in degrees of certainty. At each level of transformation, Jung correlates it with what he calls electron volts, which are a measure of energy, which is what is required at each level for the transformation. For example, a photon to transform and produce a proton requires about 1 billion electron volts, whereas an electron requires about 500,000 electron volts. And then downward further, so that's the transformation from level 1 with photons down to subatomic particles. And then with level 3, to begin to form the hydrogen atom, all that's required is 10 electron volts of energy. So you can see the number, the requirement of energy diminishing with each transformation as it goes down. And then finally with molecules at the molecular level, it's the bonds, the covalent and the ionic bondings that contain the energy in terms of 1/25th of an electron volt. So there's this principle of degree of certainty, changes in degrees of certainty as we go down. Okay, so then now he introduces this concept of symmetry. So we need to look here at our first diagram, which has to do with what he calls complete symmetry. So now this is at the level of molecules. This is the nadir of the V-shaped arc. And this is called complete symmetry, in which all the molecules are laid out in rows, columns, and layers. There is no freedom whatsoever. So there is a relationship between an increase in symmetry, and here there are 3 axes of symmetry. As you can see on the right-hand side there, we have the famous Cartesian XYZ grid. So we have 3 axes of symmetry and 0 degrees of freedom. So there's a relation between the more symmetry something has on one of these levels, the less freedom that it has. And then so that's complete symmetry. So now if we go up a level to plants, with plants now we have radial symmetry, and radial symmetry has 2 axes to it. You have the sort of vertical growth, and then you have what Goethe would call vertical growth and spiral growth. So you have these two axes of symmetry, and it's in a circle. It's in a radius. And plants, of course, have 1 degree of freedom, which is the ability to grow straight upwards, to grow vertically. And then so let's look at the next type of symmetry, which is, of course, bilateral symmetry with regard to animals. Animals are not the same front to back. They're not the same top and bottom, but they are mirror images in terms of the two halves that they have. The left half is a mirror image of the right half. And so we have bilateral symmetry. And then so with regard to light, of course, there's no symmetry. And also the same thing goes for human consciousness. But now what he wants to know is, can we apply to the left half these same types of symmetries to the left half, to the half with regard to physics? And so he says that indeed he believes that we can. Atoms, he says, for instance, have radial symmetry. They have a nucleus, so they're analogous to plants in that they have two axes of symmetry. They have a nucleus with an electron orbiting it in a circle, and they also, like plants, have 1 degree of freedom. Now, with regard to subatomic particles, he has this idea of they are analogous in a certain sense on his sort of chain of being to animals, in that both have 2 degrees of freedom, and both have what he calls bilateral symmetry. With regard to subatomic particles, they have 2 degrees of freedom because of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, where position and momentum cannot be nailed down at the same time. If you focus on momentum, you lose the particle's position. If you focus on the position, you lose the particle's momentum. So there's a probability wave of distribution of where it might be found that gives it 2 degrees of freedom. Just like with an animal on the loose, let's say, it also has 2 degrees of freedom because it can move about freely through space. And we don't know exactly where we're going to find that animal. So there's a certain uncertainty about its probability. It's probable that we're going to find a tiger in a jungle, but we don't know exactly where. So there is that. Now, the aspect of subatomic particles that have to do with bilateral symmetry has something to do with what he calls chirality. And I'll read the paragraph here. He says, as to the symmetry for subatomic particles being analogous to animals, this question cannot be answered with finality, but the experiments proposed by Li and Yang and completed by Madame Wu, which discovered that chirality or handedness characterizes nuclear particle reactions, suggest this possibility, for only that which has bilateral symmetry can have handedness. So you can't have a circle that's right-handed, but as in this illustration here, you can have a coil that is right-handed or a coil that is left-handed. And so it does indeed have, subatomic particles do indeed have bilateral symmetry. Okay, so then let's take a look then once again at the V-shaped model. So we can see now in terms of the symmetries, at the bottom there we have complete symmetry, as we have seen, no freedom. The next level up, the level of atoms, and which is analogous to plants, in that we have radial symmetry, and they have 1 degree of freedom, both of them. And then the level above that, we have bilateral symmetry between animals and subatomic particles, and they both have 2 degrees of freedom. They have more mobility than atoms do, which are locked in place. You can put atoms into crystals and lock them in place, and plants are sort of locked in place to where they grow. And then at the top then, with regard to light and with regard to transformations of the inner light in human consciousness, complete freedom, absolutely complete. So there's a couple of points that he also makes, is that at first glance it looks like you could divide his V shape itself into a bilateral symmetry, except that the left half has to do with physics, and the right half has to do with biology. And there's a further asymmetry insofar as the left half has to do with random behavior, whereas the right half has to do with voluntary behavior. These plants, animals, and humans have free will. The free will increases as it goes up the scale, but they have voluntary behavior. And so that's a major asymmetry between the two halves of the arc. And so he wants to come up with a model of control, which we'll get to in a second here. He has a couple of interesting footnotes. He says, a further point, animals and plants interchange position and energy in respect to which is free and which is constrained. Thus, the animal is free to move but unable to create its own energy, while the plant is fixed in position but able to synthesize energy from sunlight. So analogously then with atoms and particles, likewise nuclear particles are free to move in the sense that their position cannot be determined, but their mass is fixed, while the atom, which can be fixed in a crystal, is able to absorb or radiate energy, just like plants. Plants can radiate or absorb energy, just like electrons orbiting around the nuclei of atoms. So as we have noted, he says, motion requires 2 degrees of freedom, while energy absorption requires only 1 degree of freedom. Okay. So then the last point to make in this chapter is this model for control. Remember that he's a physicist and an engineer, so he thinks in these terms. So this is a model that he gives that moves clockwise, starting with position. L, I suppose, means location. And he says, now, consider the Xenos Paradox of the tortoise and Achilles. You give the tortoise a head start, according to this parable. Give it a little head start, and now Achilles should overtake it, but the problem is Achilles never can overtake it because Achilles has to reach half the distance, but before he can reach half the distance to the turtle, he has to reach a quarter of the distance, and before he can reach that, he has to reach an eighth of the distance, and so on to infinity, which locks him in place. He's never going to get anywhere. But Jung says the problem with this paradigm is that it doesn't take velocity into account. Typical with the Greek Apollonian thinking, Achilles is just locked into place, and so position is the only thing that's taken into account. And so it was left up to Newton then to define velocity and acceleration, leading to his theory of universal gravitation. And so he creates these as derivatives. The first derivative is Newton's definition of velocity as the rate of change of position with respect to time. So down below there we have velocity L, that's position times time. So velocity is the rate of change of position with relation to time. And then acceleration then, L times t squared, is the rate of change of velocity, with respect to time. So the rate of change of position with respect to time for velocity, the rate of change of velocity with respect to time. So those are two derivatives. And then the third derivative would be control, which is L times t cubed. And control now then is actually the rate of change of acceleration. And Jung, I think, extrapolates this on his own, and he says, imagine a driver driving an automobile. So you're driving in the automobile, you press on the gas, that accelerates the car, you hit the brake, that stops the car, you turn the wheel, you want to make a left turn, all of that is control, and all of that implies voluntary action, freedom of the will. And so this is the right half of his arc that physics cannot understand because it cannot factor in why organisms are, why they do what they do, and what free will is. And so this becomes the third derivative. And then eventually you come back to position as the fourth derivative. Once you make your left turn, let's say, now you've got a new destination, a new position. So that becomes the fourth derivative. And it all comes back to where it starts. And so that then is this chapter of Arthur Jung's magnificent reflexive universe. And the thing about Arthur Jung is these chapters, most of them are pretty short, but they're deceptively simple. Arthur Jung is the opposite type of writer from Aurobindo in the sense that Aurobindo is very verbose and prolix. He recapitulates his previous points. He puts the same point in different ways and goes on and on with dense, beautifully written paragraphs. Arthur Jung is an aesthetically pleasing writer, but he's straight to the point. The paragraphs are short, and there's not a single wasted sentence. Every sentence counts and contains a profound thought. It's almost got a sort of Zen-like simplicity to it. So we'll stop there with Chapter 4 of Arthur Jung's Reflexive Universe.